My husband's mistress knocked on my door and demanded that my children and I move out of our house. A woman I'd never seen before knocked on my door at 8 in the morning while my kids were eating breakfast. She stood there in designer heels and a dress that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "You need to be out by the end of the month," she said, like she was discussing the weather. "Trevor and I are ready to make this our home." I thought she was insane. Some random woman showed up at my house talking about my husband Trevor and making demands. Then she held up a key. My house key. "Trevor gave this to me. He said you'd be difficult about the transition, but that you'd eventually understand this is what's best for everyone." She walked past me into my living room like she owned the place. Started talking about paint colors and which walls she'd knock down. My 3 kids stood there watching this stranger plan renovations to their home. "The children's rooms will make perfect guest suites once they're living with you full-time," she said. Trevor promised they'd only visit on holidays. That's when I learned my husband had been having an affair with Natalie for 2 years. 2 years of business trips that were really romantic getaways. 2 years of working late meant dinner at her apartment. 2 years of lying while I raised our children and kept our home running. Natalie had emails from Trevor on her phone. Showed them to me right there in my kitchen. He'd promised her everything. The house, his retirement savings, and a fresh start without the baggage of his first family. "He's already talked to a lawyer," she said. "The papers will be served next week. Fighting will just make this harder on your children." She actually said that, like she cared about my kids while planning to steal their home. Trevor came home that night acting normal. Kissed me hello, played with the kids, ate the dinner I cooked. I didn't say anything about Natalie's visit. Wanted to see how far he'd take this lie. He even initiated intimacy that night. Held me afterward and said he loved me, all while planning to throw us out for his mistress. The next day, Natalie came back, this time with a contractor. They measured rooms and discussed budgets while I stood there documenting everything on my phone. She pointed at family photos and said, "These will all need to go, obviously. I'm thinking a more modern aesthetic." The contractor looked uncomfortable when he realized I lived there. "Ma'am, did you approve this consultation?" Natalie laughed. "She doesn't need to. This will be my house soon." That's when I started digging. Found out Natalie thought Trevor owned the house outright. He'd told her he'd bought it before we married, that I had no claim to it, that he was rich from family money and his executive salary. All lies. The house was in my name only. My grandmother had left it to me 5 years before I even met Trevor. He'd moved into my house. He had no legal claim to it at all. His executive job? He was middle management at a company that was about to downsize. His family's money? His parents were retired teachers living on Social Security. He'd been funding his affair with credit cards he'd opened in secret. $40,000 in debt for jewelry, trips, and deposits on venues for a wedding Natalie was already planning. She'd quit her job 6 months ago because Trevor told her she'd never have to work again. She'd given up her apartment and was living in a hotel he was paying for. A hotel that was about to kick her out because his credit card was maxed. I invited Natalie for coffee to discuss the transition. She showed up smug, carrying fabric samples for curtains. Started talking about how mature I was being about the situation. "Most first wives make such a fuss. But you understand Trevor deserves happiness." I let her talk. Let her describe their future. Let her show me the engagement ring Trevor had bought with a credit card that was about to be declined. Then I showed her the deed to my house. Her face went pale. "That's not possible," Trevor said. I showed her his real pay stubs. His middle management salary barely covered his car payment. She showed him the credit card statements with her hotel bills about to send him into bankruptcy. Showed her the email from his company about upcoming layoffs that would definitely include him. "He's been lying to both of us," I said. "But you're the one who quit her job and gave up her apartment for a fantasy." Natalie tried to recover. "He loves me. We'll figure it out together." That's when I played the recording of Trevor from that morning. I'd confronted him about the affair before he left for work. He'd broken down completely. "She means nothing." Natalie was just excited. "You're my wife, the mother of my children. I'll end it today. I'll do whatever it takes to save our marriage." I'd asked him directly what he'd promised her. I told her what she wanted to hear. She was so desperate for someone to save her. It was honestly pathetic how easily she believed everything. What kind of idiot quits their job for a married man? Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Natalie sat frozen across from me, staring at her phone like the screen might change if she looked long enough. Tears ran down her face and ruined her perfect makeup. She looked up at me with red eyes and asked how long I'd known about the lies. I told her I discovered everything yesterday when she showed up at my door with that key. Her face crumpled and she put her head in her hands. I watched her shoulders shake and felt nothing. This woman had walked into my home and talked about turning my kids' rooms into guest suites. She'd planned my family's destruction while standing in my kitchen. The tears on her phone screen made the recording pause button look blurry. She wiped her eyes with a napkin and asked if I had more proof. I showed her the credit card statements I'd found that morning, all $40,000 of debt Trevor had hidden. She went pale, reading through the charges at restaurants and hotels, jewelry stores, and a wedding venue deposit. Her hands shook when she reached the hotel bill from last week, the one about to max out his final card. She admitted she had nowhere to go and less than $200 in her bank account. The hotel bill was due tomorrow, and Trevor's credit card would be declined. She'd given up her apartment 6 months ago, when he promised she'd never need to work again. I watched her realize she'd destroyed her life for a fantasy. Part of me felt satisfied seeing her understand what Trevor had done to both of us. But another part felt sorry for her because I knew exactly how she felt right now. That moment when everything you believed turns out to be lies. When the future you planned disappears in an instant. I'd felt it yesterday morning when she showed up at my door. She was feeling it now at this coffee shop table. I told Natalie she needed to figure out her own situation because I had 3 children to protect. My voice came out harder than I meant it to, but I couldn't help her. She'd chosen to believe a married man's promises and quit her job without checking if any of it was real. Those were her choices, and now she had to deal with them. She nodded without looking at me and stood up from the table. The fabric samples for curtains sat between us, and she left them there when she walked out. I sat alone for another 20 minutes drinking cold coffee and trying to process everything. My husband had destroyed 2 women's lives with his lies. He'd promised Natalie a future that didn't exist while promising me a marriage that was already over. He'd spent money we didn't have on a relationship that meant nothing to him. The recording on my phone proved he'd called her pathetic for believing him. But he'd also called me his wife and the mother of his children while planning to throw us out. I didn't know which woman he'd lied to more. Maybe he'd lied to both of us equally. Maybe he'd lied so much he didn't even know what the truth was anymore. When I got home, Trevor was playing video games in the living room like nothing had happened. And our kids were at the school and he'd taken the day off work, claiming he felt sick. I stood in the doorway watching him mash buttons on the controller. His eyes stayed locked on the TV screen where cartoon characters fought each other. This was the man I'd been married to for 13 years, the father of my 3 children. The person I'd trusted completely with my life and my future. He looked like a stranger sitting on my couch in my house. His hair needed washing and he wore the same clothes from yesterday. Empty soda cans covered the coffee table and a pizza box sat open on the floor. He hadn't even bothered to clean up or pretend everything was normal. He just sat there playing games in the middle of the day while his life fell apart around him. I thought about all the nights he'd come home late from work, all the business trips that were really romantic getaways, all the times he'd held me and said he loved me while planning to leave. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I told Trevor I'd met with Natalie and knew everything about the promises, the debt, and the lies. He dropped the game controller and his face went pale. The controller bounced off the couch and landed on the floor. His character died on screen, but he didn't notice. He started talking fast, making excuses about how things got out of control, and he never meant for any of this to happen. The words poured out of him in a rush. He said Natalie had pursued him and he'd been weak. He said the affair meant nothing and he'd just been telling her what she wanted to hear. He said the debt wasn't as bad as it looked, and he had a plan to pay it off. He said he loved me and the kids and couldn't lose us. Every sentence was another lie or excuse or blame shifted onto someone else. And I stood there listening to him try to talk his way out of destroying our family. His voice got higher and more desperate as he talked. Sweat appeared on his forehead. He kept running his hands through his hair and looking around the room like he was searching for something to save him. Trevor stood up and tried to hug me, reaching for me with both arms. I stepped back and told him I needed space to think. He followed me down the hallway as I walked toward our bedroom. His voice rose as he pleaded his case, saying he'd do anything to fix this. I grabbed an overnight bag from the closet and started packing clothes. He stood in the doorway talking about counseling and second chances and how every marriage had problems. I packed pajamas for the kids and their toothbrushes from the bathroom. He followed me from room to room, his voice getting louder. I packed my laptop and phone charger. He grabbed my arm and I pulled away, telling him not to touch me. His face crumpled and he started crying, saying he couldn't lose me. I told him I was taking the kids to my sister's place for a few days, so I could figure out what to do next. He blocked the bedroom door and said we needed to talk this through right now. I told him to move. He didn't. I pulled out my phone and said I'd call the police if he didn't let me leave. He moved. I picked up the kids from the school early and told them we were having a sleepover at Aunt Lila's house. They climbed into the car excited, asking if they could stay up late and watch movies. Brandon wanted to know if Lila would make her famous pancakes for breakfast. Jimena asked if she could bring her stuffed animals. Solomon just kept saying he loved sleepovers. They didn't ask why we were leaving in the middle of a school day, or why I'd pulled them out of class early. They just chattered happily in the back seat about what games they'd play with their aunt. My phone buzzed constantly during the drive. Trevor sent 17 texts alternating between apologies and accusations that I was overreacting. He said I was being dramatic and making things worse. He said I was hurting the kids by taking them away from their home. No, he said I was refusing to listen to his side of the story. Then he'd apologize and beg me to come back so we could talk. Then he'd get angry again and say I was the one destroying our family. I turned my phone on silent and focused on driving. At Lila's apartment, I finally broke down and told her everything while the kids watched a movie in the other room. She held me while I cried on her couch. Then she got angry on my behalf, saying things about Trevor I wouldn't repeat in front of the kids. She paced around her living room listing all the ways he'd betrayed me. She brought me tissues and tea and let me talk until my voice went hoarse. She said she'd never liked Trevor but had kept quiet because I seemed happy. She said she'd always thought something was off about him but couldn't put her finger on it. Now it all made sense. She insisted I call a divorce attorney first thing tomorrow morning. She said I needed to protect myself and the kids before Trevor did more damage. She pulled up her laptop and started searching for lawyers who specialized in cases like mine. Her anger felt good because I was too tired to be angry anymore. I just felt numb and sad and scared about what came next. That night, I lay awake on Lila's couch listening to my children sleep in the guest room. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and occasional car passing outside. I thought about all the times Trevor had come home late from work with excuses about meetings and deadlines, all the business trips where he'd barely called home, all the moments I'd trusted him completely while he was with her. The betrayal felt like something heavy sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I'd believed in our marriage and our future together. I'd believed he was working hard to support our family when really he was building a life with someone else. I'd believed his kisses and his promises while he planned to throw us away. Every memory from the past 2 years was contaminated now. Every holiday, every family dinner, every time he'd said he loved me. All of it was happening while he told another woman she was his future. I pulled Lila's blanket tighter around me and watched shadows move across the ceiling. In the morning, Lila helped me research divorce attorneys while the kids ate breakfast in front of cartoons. We found Veronica Vaughn, who specialized in cases involving hidden debt and infidelity. Her website showed reviews from other women who'd been through similar situations. One review said she'd protected a client's inherited property from a cheating husband. Another said she'd helped expose secret credit cards and gambling debts. Lila called the office and explained my situation to the receptionist. They had an opening that afternoon for a consultation. Lila said she'd watch the kids so I could go alone. I wrote down the address and appointment time. My hands shook holding the pen. This was really happening. I was hiring a divorce lawyer and ending my marriage. The kids laughed at something on TV, and I wondered how I'd explain this to them. The office building looked older than I expected. Pale brick with small windows and a parking lot that needed repaving. I checked the address twice before pulling in. Veronica Vaughn's office was on the 3rd floor, and the elevator made grinding noises that matched how my stomach felt. The waiting room had beige carpet and magazines from 6 months ago. A receptionist smiled and told me to have a seat. I clutched my folder of documents and tried not to think about what I was actually doing here. Getting a divorce lawyer, ending my marriage, breaking up my kids' family. The door opened and a woman in her 50s walked out. She wore a navy suit and had gray streaks in her dark hair pulled back in a bun. Her handshake was firm and her eyes were kind but sharp. She led me into her office and gestured to a chair across from her desk. I sat down and opened the folder with shaking hands. The house deed came out first. She studied it carefully, running her finger down the page to where only my name appeared. Then I showed her the credit card statements I'd printed from Trevor's email. Her eyebrows went up as she scanned the charges. Hotels in Miami, jewelry stores, restaurant bills for 2. The recording played on my phone and she listened without interrupting. Trevor's voice filled the small office, admitting Natalie meant nothing and calling her pathetic. When it ended, Veronica set down her pen and looked at me. She said I was in a strong legal position. The house belonged to me alone through inheritance. The debt was entirely in Trevor's name. I had evidence of his affair and his lies. She asked about our children, and I told her about Brandon, Jimena, and Solomon. She made notes on a yellow legal pad. We talked about protecting my assets and keeping the kids stable through this. She asked if Trevor had access to our joint accounts, and I said yes. She wrote something down and underlined it twice. Veronica explained that what Trevor did counted as financial infidelity. He'd hidden major debt while making decisions about our family's future. That would help my case in court. She said I needed to open a separate bank account right away and move my paycheck there. I should document everything we owned together. Get copies of bank statements, investment accounts, retirement funds, anything with both our names. Take photos of valuable items in the house. Make a list of everything. She said Trevor might try to hide assets or drain accounts once he knew I was serious about divorce. I needed to move fast. She could file for a restraining order on our joint savings to freeze it until the court decided how to split things. I asked how long this would take, and she said it depended on whether Trevor fought me. If he contested custody or tried to claim he deserved part of the house, it could drag on for months. But given the evidence I had, she thought he'd eventually settle. I left her office with a list of tasks and a retainer agreement to sign. My hands still shook as I drove back toward my house. Trevor's car wasn't in the driveway when I pulled up. He'd be at work for another 4 hours at least. I went straight to his office and started opening drawers. File folders full of papers I'd never seen before. I photographed every page with my phone. Bank statements showing transfers I didn't recognize. Credit card bills I'd never known existed. Investment accounts I thought had more money in them. I downloaded statements from his laptop using the password he didn't know I knew. His email held more surprises. Messages to Natalie about trips they'd taken while I thought he was at conferences. Photos of them together at restaurants I couldn't afford. Receipts for jewelry I'd never received. I moved to his car next. The glove compartment had more credit card bills stuffed in the back. Charges at expensive hotels. Payments to wedding venues. Deposits on a honeymoon cruise. The total kept climbing as I added everything up. Not $40,000 like I'd thought. Closer to $45,000. All of it spent on another woman while I used coupons at the grocery store. I took photos of everything and uploaded them to a cloud account he couldn't access. Then I put everything back exactly where I'd found it. The whole process took 3 hours and left me exhausted and angry. Trevor's car pulled into the driveway at 6:15. I was still in his office with papers spread across the desk. I heard his footsteps come down the hall and stop in the doorway. He looked at me sitting in his chair, looked at the credit card statements laid out in neat rows, looked at the bank records showing transfers to accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. His face went red and he started yelling. I was invading his privacy, going through his personal things, acting crazy and paranoid. He said I had no right to snoop through his office like some jealous psycho. I let him yell until he ran out of steam. Then I told him calmly that I'd hired a divorce attorney. I'd met with her that afternoon and showed her everything. The affair, the debt, the lies about owning the house. She said I had a strong case. He needed to pack a bag and find somewhere else to stay tonight. His face changed from angry to shocked. He said I couldn't kick him out of his own house. This was his home too. He'd lived here for over a decade. He had rights. I stood up and walked to the filing cabinet, pulled out the house deed and held it up so he could see. My name was the only one on it. My grandmother had left it to me before I ever met him. He'd moved into my house. He had no legal claim to any of it. Trevor's face did something I'd never seen before. It crumbled like paper getting crushed. He said that wasn't possible. We'd lived here together all these years, raised our kids here, made a life here. How could the house just be mine? I reminded him he'd told Natalie the same lies, that he owned it, that I'd have to leave, that he could give it to her. All false. He'd been living in my house rent-free while going into massive debt to impress his mistress. He tried to argue, said the law wouldn't see it that way. Marriage meant shared property. I told him to call a lawyer and ask. The house was mine through inheritance and his name had never been added to the deed. He sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. Then he started crying. Big gasping sobs that made his shoulders shake. He said he was sorry. He'd made terrible mistakes. He'd do anything to fix this. We could go to counseling. He'd end things with Natalie completely. He'd get a second job to pay off the debt. Just please don't throw him out. Don't take his kids away. Don't destroy everything we'd built. I told him he'd destroyed it himself. He needed to pack a bag and leave tonight. Tomorrow we could figure out a schedule for him to see the kids. But tonight, he had to go. Trevor refused to move. He said he wasn't going anywhere. This was his home and his family. I couldn't force him to leave. I pulled out my phone and called my father. Dad answered on the second ring and I asked if he could come over. I needed help with something. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Trevor's eyes went wide when he realized what I'd done. He knew my father was a retired police officer. Knew Dad would side with me. Knew he'd make sure Trevor left without causing a scene. He stood up and started pacing. Said I was being unreasonable, making this harder than it needed to be. We could work this out if I'd just calm down and think rationally. I didn't respond, just sat there watching him panic. When Dad's truck pulled up outside, Trevor finally went to the bedroom to pack. I heard drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping in the closet, a suitcase zipper. Dad came in through the front door and I hugged him. He asked if I was okay and I nodded. Said I just needed him here to make sure things stayed calm. Trevor came out with a duffel bag and a rolling suitcase. He looked at my father standing in the living room with his arms crossed. Dad didn't say anything, just stood there looking official despite being in jeans and a flannel shirt. Trevor tried one more time, turned to me with tears on his face and begged me to reconsider. Said he loved me and the kids. Said he'd made mistakes but he could change. Said he'd do anything. I told him to leave. He picked up his bags and walked out the door. I watched through the window as he loaded them into his car. Watched him sit in the driver's seat for a long minute before starting the engine. Watched him back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. Dad put his hand on my shoulder and asked where I thought Trevor would go. I said probably a motel, the cheap kind that took cash. His credit cards were maxed out and he didn't have many options. The next morning, I made pancakes for breakfast. The kids sat at the table eating and talking about school projects. Brandon had a science fair coming up. Jimena needed help with her math homework, and Solomon wanted to know if he could have a friend over this weekend. I waited until they'd finished eating before telling them I needed to talk about something important. Their faces got serious. Brandon put down his fork and looked at me with worried eyes. I said Dad and I were having some grown-up problems and needed time apart. He was staying somewhere else for a while so we could figure things out. Brandon asked immediately if we were getting divorced. His voice cracked on the word. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. We needed time to think about what was best for everyone. But both parents loved them very much. That wouldn't change no matter what happened. Jimena started crying, asked if it was her fault, if she'd done something wrong. I pulled her into a hug and said no. This was about problems between adults, nothing the kids had done. Solomon looked confused, asked when Dad was coming home. I said he'd see Dad soon. We'd work out a schedule for visits. Brandon pushed back from the table and said he knew something was wrong. He'd heard us fighting, seen Dad sleeping on the couch. He wasn't stupid. I apologized for not telling them sooner. Said I was trying to figure things out before worrying them. He said that made it worse. Now he didn't know what to believe. I drove the kids to the school and watched them walk into the building. Brandon didn't look back. Jimena wiped her eyes before going in. Solomon waved from the doorway. Then I headed back to Veronica's office for our second meeting. She had paperwork ready for me to sign. Divorce petition, financial disclosures, a request for a restraining order on our joint bank accounts. She explained each document before I signed. Said she'd file everything with the court today. Trevor would be served within a week. We talked about custody arrangements. She recommended I ask for primary physical custody, with Trevor getting visitation rights. Given his current living situation and financial problems, the court would likely agree. She also gave me names of family therapists who worked with children of divorce. Said the kids would need support through this transition. I took the list and promised to call. She asked if I'd opened a separate bank account yet. I said no, but I'd do it today. She stressed how important that was. Trevor might try to drain the joint accounts once he got served. I needed my money protected before that happened. I left her office with copies of everything we'd filed. The divorce was real now. Official. There was no going back from this. Trevor's mother called while I was at the bank. Her number showed up on my phone and I almost didn't answer. But I knew she'd keep calling until I did. Her voice was thick with tears when I picked up. She said Trevor had called her last night saying I'd kicked him out over nothing. That I was being cruel and unreasonable. That he didn't understand what he'd done wrong. She asked me to please reconsider. To think about the children and the family we'd built together. I took a deep breath and told her the truth. About the affair with Natalie. About the lies he'd told both of us. About the $45,000 in secret debt he'd racked up. About him promising to give my house to another woman. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she said she had no idea. Trevor had told her everything was fine. That I was just going through something and being difficult. I said he'd lied to everyone. Me, Natalie, his parents, probably people at work. She apologized. Said she should have known something was wrong. Asked if there was anything she could do. I told her she could talk to Trevor about taking responsibility for his choices. About being honest for once. About being a good father even if he'd been a terrible husband. She said she would. Then she admitted she and Trevor's father couldn't help him financially. They were living on fixed retirement income and barely making ends meet themselves. I said I understood. We said goodbye, and I sat in the bank parking lot for a while before going inside. Veronica called me 3 days later. She'd served Trevor with the divorce papers at his workplace that morning. He'd been walking into the building when the process server handed him the envelope. She said he'd called her office within an hour. He was angry and humiliated, threatened to fight for custody of the kids, said he'd contest the divorce and make this as difficult as possible. He claimed he deserved half the house despite what the deed said, insisted he had rights after living there so long. Veronica said she'd told him to get his own attorney and have them call her, that nothing he said would change the facts. The house was mine. The debt was his. The affair was documented. He had no legal ground to stand on. My phone rang minutes after I hung up with Veronica. Trevor's name flashed on the screen. I answered, and he immediately started yelling. How could I do this to him? Serve him at work where everyone could see? Humiliate him in front of his coworkers? I was destroying his reputation and his career. I said calmly that he'd destroyed those things himself. The divorce papers just made it official. He said he'd fight me for everything. The kids, the house, whatever money was left. I'd regret treating him this way. I told him to have his lawyer contact mine and ended the call. I spent the next morning researching family therapists who specialized in helping kids through divorce. Found Isabella Curtis online with reviews from other parents going through separations. Her office could see us that week. I called and scheduled appointments for all 3 kids. Brandon's would be Tuesday after school, Jimena's on Wednesday, and Solomon's on Thursday. The receptionist asked if I wanted to come in first to discuss the situation. I said yes and booked myself for Monday afternoon. That same day, Trevor's phone started ringing constantly. He was still staying at the motel, calling me every few hours with updates I didn't ask for. Around 3 in the afternoon, his name flashed on my screen again. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice sounded different. Panicked. He said his boss had called him into a meeting that morning. The company was doing layoffs. His entire department was restructured. They were eliminating his position. He had 2 months of severance pay, and then nothing. He started talking fast, saying we needed to stop the divorce proceedings, that we could work this out, that he'd made mistakes, but losing his job changed everything. We needed to be practical about our situation. I listened to him spiral for about 3 minutes before I interrupted. I told him the divorce was happening regardless of his employment status, that his job situation was his problem to solve, not mine. He got quiet. Then he asked if I understood what this meant for child support, for the kid's future. I said I understood perfectly, that he should have thought about consequences before he racked up $45,000 in debt and destroyed our marriage. He hung up on me. My phone buzzed with a message request on social media that evening. Natalie's profile picture showed up in my notifications. The message said she knew I probably didn't want to hear from her, that she was staying with a friend but needed to find work and get back on her feet. She said she was sorry for her role in everything, that she should have questioned Trevor's stories more carefully, that she'd been desperate and stupid. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I told her I didn't know what she expected me to say. She replied immediately asking if we could meet for coffee one more time. She said she needed to show me something. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe I wanted to see how far Trevor's lies had spread. Maybe I just wanted to watch her suffer a little more. I told her to meet me at the same place we'd gone before, 2 days from now at 10 in the morning. Natalie looked worse than I'd ever seen her when she walked into the coffee shop. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. No makeup. Wearing jeans and a plain shirt instead of the designer clothes she'd shown up in before. She had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. We sat down and she immediately started talking. Trevor had been calling her constantly. Sometimes he blamed her for ruining his marriage. Other times he begged her to take him back. He'd call at 2 in the morning crying. Then call at 7 angry and accusing. She said she'd blocked his number twice, but he kept finding ways to contact her. Using different phones, creating new email addresses, showing up at her friend's apartment building. She pulled out her phone and opened her messages. Started scrolling through texts from numbers she didn't recognize. All from Trevor. All saying the same desperate things in different ways. I read through the messages she showed me. Trevor was telling her I was being unreasonable, that I'd kicked him out over nothing, that he still loved her, and they could still be together once he sorted out the divorce. He was promising her they'd get through this together. That his lawyer said he had a good case for getting half the house. That his severance pay would tide them over until he found a better job. Every single thing he was telling her was a lie. I looked up at Natalie and saw she knew it too. She said she'd finally looked up property records online. Verified that I owned the house outright. She'd called his company pretending to be calling for him and learned about the layoffs. She'd checked court records and seen the divorce papers. She said she couldn't believe she'd been so stupid. That she'd given up everything for someone who couldn't tell the truth about anything. I told her Trevor was still lying to both of us because he couldn't face reality. That he'd rather keep spinning stories than deal with what he'd done. Monday afternoon, I met with Isabella Curtis alone before bringing the kids in. She had a warm office with comfortable chairs and toys in the corner for younger children. I explained the whole situation while she took notes. The affair, the lies, the financial mess, the divorce. She asked about the kids and how they were handling everything. I told her Brandon was angry and withdrawn. Jimena kept asking if this was her fault. Solomon didn't fully understand, but he could sense something was wrong. Isabella said those reactions were completely normal for their ages. She'd work with each of them individually at first, and then maybe do some family sessions later. She also suggested I consider individual therapy for myself. I said I'd think about it. The kids had their first sessions that week. Brandon went first and barely talked, according to Isabella. He answered her questions with one-word responses and spent most of the time staring at the floor. Jimena cried through half of her session, asking if Mommy and Daddy would get back together. Solomon mostly played with the toys and asked when he could see his dad again. Isabella called me after all 3 appointments and said they were processing things normally. Brandon's anger was expected. Jimena's sadness made sense. Solomon's confusion was appropriate for his age. She wanted to see them weekly for now and check in with me every few weeks about their progress. Maddox came over on Saturday with his toolbox and a bag from the hardware store. He'd bought new locks for all the doors and a security camera for the front entrance. I told him Trevor had been driving by the house at weird hours. Sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning before the kids woke up. He'd sit in his car across the street for 20 minutes just staring at the house. Maddox installed the new locks first. Then he mounted the camera above the front door and showed me how to check the footage on my phone. We spent the rest of the afternoon loading Trevor's remaining stuff into Maddox's truck. His clothes from the closet, his books from the shelves, his tools from the garage. Everything went into boxes and then into a storage unit Maddox had rented. I kept the key. Trevor could get his things when he found a permanent place to live. That evening, I sat down with each kid separately to answer their questions. Brandon came first. He sat on his bed with his arms crossed and asked me directly if Dad had cheated on me. I told him yes. He asked if that's why we were getting divorced. I said yes. He wanted to know if Dad was coming back. I said no. He nodded and didn't say anything else for a while. Then he asked if I was okay. I told him I would be. Jimena was next. She curled up next to me on the couch and asked if we could ever be a family again. I told her gently that Dad and I wouldn't be married anymore, but we'd both always be her parents. She asked if it was because of something she did. I promised her this had nothing to do with her or her brothers, that sometimes adults make bad choices that hurt the people they love. Solomon just wanted to know if he'd still see his dad. I told him yes, that Dad loved him very much and they'd spend time together soon. Trevor called me the following week saying he'd found an apartment. It was small and not in a great area, but it was all he could afford with his severance pay. He'd moved his stuff out of storage. He asked if he could see the kids. I said yes, but only supervised visits for now. We agreed he could come to Lila's house every other Saturday afternoon. The first visit happened that weekend. Trevor showed up with a bag of toys he couldn't afford and guilt written all over his face. The kids were excited to see him at first. They ran to him and he hugged them tight. But the afternoon was awkward. Long silences, forced conversations, Trevor trying too hard to act like everything was normal. Brandon barely engaged. Jimena kept looking at me like she needed permission to enjoy herself. Solomon was the only one who seemed genuinely happy. When Trevor left, he hugged each kid and promised he'd see them again soon. The phone calls started coming a few days later. Unknown numbers at first, then calls from 800 numbers, all looking for Trevor. Credit card companies wanting to know where he was, when he'd be making payments, if I knew how to reach him. I explained each time that we were separated, that I didn't have access to his accounts or his financial information. I gave them his new address and his phone number. One collector told me they were considering legal action, that the debt had gone unpaid for months, that they'd tried reaching him at his work number but he was no longer employed there. I felt a wave of relief knowing those accounts were only in his name, that his financial disaster couldn't touch me or the kids. Veronica filed the paperwork for temporary custody and child support the following Monday. She called me that afternoon to explain the court had scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. The judge would review Trevor's employment situation and determine support based on his previous salary, even though he currently had no income. She warned me Trevor's lawyer would argue for reduced payments given his unemployment, but the court typically expected parents to maintain their earning capacity. Trevor would need to find work fast or face serious consequences for non-payment. I scheduled an appointment with Kira Barrett, a credit counselor Veronica recommended. Her office was in a small building downtown, decorated with motivational posters about financial freedom. Kira was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with bright red glasses and a warm smile. She pulled up spreadsheets on her computer and asked detailed questions about my income, bills, and monthly expenses. I showed her bank statements, utility bills, and my paycheck stubs. She typed numbers into her software and studied the results. After 20 minutes, she turned the screen toward me and walked through a detailed budget. My income alone could cover everything since I owned the house outright. No mortgage meant I had flexibility other single parents didn't have. It would be tight, she said, especially with 3 kids. But manageable if I planned carefully and built an emergency fund. She helped me identify areas to cut back and showed me how to track spending. By the end of the meeting, I felt lighter. I could do this without Trevor's money. The house my grandmother left me was saving my family. That night, after the kids went to bed, I opened my laptop to check email. Trevor had sent a message at 2 a.m. with the subject line, "I'm sorry." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. The email was long, rambling, full of apologies and self-pity. He wrote that he messed up everything and didn't know how to fix it, that he never meant to hurt me or the kids, that Natalie had pursued him and he was weak, that he was scared and made terrible choices. He claimed he still loved me and wanted to work things out if I'd give him another chance. The whole thing made me angry all over again. No real accountability, just excuses. He blamed Natalie for pursuing him instead of owning his decisions. He talked about his fear and weakness like those were valid reasons to destroy our family. I closed the laptop without responding. He didn't deserve my energy. 2 weeks later, I heard through a mutual friend that Natalie found work as a receptionist at a dental office. She'd rented a small studio apartment in a cheaper part of town, the kind of place she never would have considered when she thought she was marrying into money. The friend said Natalie had blocked Trevor's number and refused to talk about him. She'd apparently told people she learned an expensive lesson about believing men who make big promises. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sympathy. She'd been lied to just like me, even if her role in my pain made it hard to feel too sorry for her. The custody hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. I wore a simple dress and minimal makeup, wanting to look responsible and stable. Veronica met me outside the courtroom and reviewed what to expect. Trevor sat across the room with his lawyer, looking defeated in a wrinkled suit. His hair needed cutting and he'd lost weight. The judge was a stern woman in her 50s who reviewed our case with no visible emotion. She asked Trevor about his job search and he stammered through an explanation about applications and interviews. She asked me about childcare arrangements and I described the kids' routine, their schools, their therapy sessions with Isabella. After an hour of questions and testimony, the judge granted me primary physical custody. Trevor would get supervised visitation every other weekend at a location we'd agree on. The judge also ordered child support based on Trevor's previous income, not his current unemployment. His lawyer objected, but the judge was firm. Trevor had voluntarily left his job, and the court expected him to maintain his earning capacity. He looked like he might cry as the judge dismissed us. I walked out feeling relieved but not victorious. This was just the beginning of a long process. I started individual therapy the next week. My therapist was an older woman named Dr. Smith, who specialized in divorce and family trauma. She asked me to describe my feelings about the marriage ending, and I found myself crying within the first 10 minutes. I'd been holding everything together for the kids, staying strong and practical. But sitting in her quiet office, I finally let myself feel the grief. Dr. Smith helped me understand I wasn't just mourning the relationship, but the future I thought we'd have together. The plans we'd made, the life I'd imagined, all of it was gone. She validated my anger while also pushing me toward acceptance. She said it was okay to be furious at Trevor for what he did. But eventually, I'd need to process that anger and move forward for my own peace. The sessions became a safe place to be honest about my pain, without worrying about how it affected my kids. Trevor called me 3 weeks after the hearing to say he'd found a job. Sales position at a car dealership, commission-based, paying less than his previous salary but giving him some income. He immediately complained about how unfair the child support order was, how he could barely afford rent and basic expenses after the payment came out. I reminded him these were consequences of his own choices. He created the debt, had the affair, lost his job through his own actions. The judge's order wasn't unfair, it was holding him accountable. He got quiet and then asked if we could talk about reducing the amount. I said no and ended the call. Veronica had already told me the court was unlikely to modify the order this quickly anyway. The kids started their new routine of visiting Trevor every other weekend at Lila's house. She'd agreed to supervise until the court decided Trevor could have unsupervised time. The first few visits were awkward. Brandon barely talked to his father, clearly still angry about everything that happened. Jimena tried to act normal, but Isabella said she was struggling with divided loyalty, wanting to love her dad, but feeling like that betrayed me. Solomon was the only one who seemed genuinely happy during visits, too young to fully understand the complications. Trevor brought them small gifts he couldn't afford and tried too hard to make everything fun. The kids came home exhausted from the emotional effort of pretending things were okay. A month into Trevor's new job, he called sounding panicked. His creditors had started garnishing his wages for the unpaid credit card debt. The garnishment took a huge chunk of his paycheck, leaving him with barely enough to cover rent and food. He asked again about reducing child support, and I refused again. I felt no sympathy for his financial crisis. He'd created it by lying and spending money he didn't have on an affair. Veronica confirmed the court wouldn't modify the order this soon, especially since his financial problems were self-inflicted. Trevor would have to figure out how to live on what was left after his obligations were met. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from a bankruptcy attorney named Antonio Hodges. The letter explained Trevor was filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy to discharge the credit card debt. I called Antonio's office immediately, worried this might affect me somehow. Antonio was patient and professional, explaining the bankruptcy was Trevor's alone since the debt was only in his name. It wouldn't touch my credit or my assets. The discharge would eliminate Trevor's obligation to the credit card companies, but wouldn't affect child support or any other court-ordered payments. I hung up feeling grateful all over again that I'd kept my finances separate from Trevor's. His financial disaster was his problem, not mine or the kids. Dad came over on a Saturday morning with a yellow notepad and his reading glasses. We sat at the kitchen table while the kids watched cartoons in the living room. He'd already looked at my budget spreadsheet and made notes about where I could cut back and where I had some flexibility. We started with the basics, figuring out exactly how much I could put away each month without making life hard for the kids. It wasn't much, maybe $100 split 3 ways into separate savings accounts. Dad showed me how compound interest worked over 10 years, drawing little graphs on his notepad. The numbers looked small now, but they'd grow. Brandon would be starting college in 6 years and every dollar mattered. Dad told me about 529 plans and tax advantages I didn't understand. He explained it twice until it made sense. We set up automatic transfers so I wouldn't have to think about it each month. The money would move from checking to savings before I could spend it on something else. Dad looked at me across the table and said he was proud of how I handled everything. That I protected my children and kept my head clear when most people would have fallen apart. His words made my throat tight. I'd felt like I was barely holding things together, just reacting to each new crisis. But Dad saw strength I didn't know I had. He squeezed my hand and said my grandmother would be proud too. She'd left me the house knowing I'd need that security someday. Maybe she'd known better than I did what kind of man Trevor would turn out to be. Friday afternoon, Trevor texted saying he couldn't take the kids this weekend. Said he had the flu and didn't want to get them sick. I stared at the message knowing it was probably a lie. He'd been getting more withdrawn lately, showing up to pickups looking exhausted and defeated. The kids were already packed, excited to show him their school projects. I called them into the kitchen and explained Dad wasn't feeling well. Brandon's face went hard. He said he knew this would happen, that Dad would start flaking out on them. Jimena looked like she might cry but held it together. Solomon just asked if they could still go next weekend instead. I tried to sound positive, telling them Dad loved them and would never miss a visit unless he was really sick. Brandon wasn't buying it. He said Dad let everyone down. That's what he did. I wanted to defend Trevor but couldn't find the words. My son was right. Trevor had a pattern of disappointing people when things got hard. I suggested we have a movie night instead. Order pizza and make it special. The kids agreed, but the excitement was gone. They went back to their rooms to unpack while I texted Trevor back saying I hoped he felt better. He didn't respond. Later that night, I heard Brandon on the phone with Trevor, his voice tight with anger. I stood outside his door listening. Brandon told his father he didn't believe the flu story, that everyone could tell he was just depressed about his life. Trevor must have said something because Brandon got quiet. Then my son said something that broke my heart. He told Trevor he was tired of making excuses for him to Jimena and Solomon, that the younger kids still believed Dad was a good person, but Brandon knew better. He hung up without saying goodbye. 3 weeks later, Veronica and I sat in a conference room with Trevor and his attorney for mediation. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who spoke in calm, measured tones. Trevor looked worse than I'd seen him, his shirt wrinkled and his hair too long. His attorney was young, probably fresh out of law school, clearly working cheap. Veronica had her files organized in neat folders, every document labeled and tabbed. Trevor's attorney started by saying his client wanted more visitation time and a reduction in child support. He argued Trevor had completed his parenting class and proved himself responsible. The support amount was leaving him unable to afford basic necessities. Veronica countered that Trevor's financial problems were self-inflicted and not the children's burden. The court had already set support based on his earning capacity, not his current situation. The mediator asked what visitation arrangement we could agree on. I said I'd accept unsupervised visits once Trevor completed the parenting class, which he had. Trevor looked relieved until Veronica added that the support amount would stay the same. His attorney argued for another 20 minutes, but the mediator sided with us. Trevor's debt and unemployment were consequences of his choices. The children shouldn't suffer because their father made poor decisions. We compromised on a schedule where Trevor got the kids every other weekend and one evening per week. He'd have them for half the summer break. But the support stayed at the court-ordered amount. Trevor signed the agreement without looking at me. His attorney packed up quickly, probably embarrassed by how poorly the mediation went. Veronica and I stayed behind to review the paperwork. She said this was a good outcome, that Trevor's attorney had been grasping at straws. I felt tired more than victorious. This was my children's father sitting across from me looking broken and desperate. There was no satisfaction in watching him fall apart, just sadness that this was what our marriage had become. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 months after Natalie knocked on my door. I wore a navy dress and carried a folder with copies of everything. Trevor sat with his cheap attorney at the other table. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement and asked if we both understood the terms. We both said yes. She asked if either of us wanted to contest anything. We both said no. The judge signed the papers and declared our marriage dissolved. It took less than 15 minutes. I felt relief wash over me mixed with this weird sadness I hadn't expected. This was really over. 13 years of marriage ended with a judge's signature and a few questions. I looked at Trevor across the courtroom and barely recognized him. He'd aged 10 years and 3 months. His face was drawn, his eyes empty. He sat there with his attorney who couldn't afford a decent suit, facing the reality of everything he'd lost. His house that was never his wife who'd trusted him completely, his children who were learning to live without him, his financial security that had been built on lies and credit cards. The judge asked if there was anything else, and we both said no. Veronica gathered her papers and we left through the side door. Trevor and his attorney went out the front. I didn't try to talk to him. There was nothing left to say. I kept my married name when I filled out the paperwork at the DMV. The clerk asked if I wanted to change it back, and I said no. My kids had this last name, and I didn't want them confused about family identity. Didn't want them wondering why Mom had a different name on the school forms and permission slips. The house stayed solely in my name, exactly as it had been. Trevor had no claim to any of my assets. The settlement made that crystal clear. My grandmother's gift remained mine, protecting me and my children exactly as she'd intended. I drove home from the courthouse feeling strange, free but also unmoored. I'd been a wife for 13 years, and now I wasn't. That identity had shaped so much of my daily life. Now I had to figure out who I was as just me. Not Trevor's wife, not part of a couple. Just a single mother with 3 kids and a house and a job. The freedom felt good, but also scary. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes. This was my house, my space, my life. Trevor had left the courthouse without speaking to me, just walked to his car and drove away. I wondered what he was thinking. If he regretted everything or just felt sorry for himself. If he blamed me for not forgiving him or finally accepted responsibility for his choices. I'd probably never know and realized I didn't need to. His thoughts and feelings weren't my problem anymore. A message from Natalie appeared in my inbox that evening. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. She said she was dating someone new, a guy who treated her well and was honest about his situation. He had his own place and a steady job and didn't make promises he couldn't keep. She thanked me for showing her the truth about Trevor, even though it was painful at the time. Said she'd learned an expensive lesson about believing men who made big promises. She hoped I found happiness and that my kids were doing okay. The message was short and genuine. I wrote back saying I was glad she'd moved on and wished her well. No hard feelings. We'd both been victims of Trevor's lies in different ways. She'd lost a job and an apartment. I'd lost a marriage and years of trust. Neither of us deserved what he'd done. I closed the laptop and didn't think about Natalie again. She was moving forward with her life, and I needed to do the same. Trevor finished his parenting class 6 weeks after the divorce was final. The court approved unsupervised visitation, and suddenly my kids were packing bags to stay at his apartment for the weekend. I helped them pack on Friday afternoon, making sure they had everything they needed. Solomon was excited, asking if Dad had toys at his new place. Jimena was nervous, asking if I'd be okay alone. Brandon was quiet, just throwing clothes in his bag without much care. I drove them to Trevor's apartment across town. It was in a complex near the highway, small and basic. Trevor met us in the parking lot and helped carry bags upstairs. I didn't go inside, just watched them disappear through the door. Then I drove home to an empty house. I paced the living room for an hour, checking my phone every few minutes. Made myself dinner but couldn't eat. Watched TV without paying attention. Went to bed early but couldn't sleep. This was the first night my children had spent away from me since the separation. The house felt too quiet. I kept thinking about them in Trevor's small apartment, wondering if they were comfortable, if he'd fed them properly, if he was being a good father or just going through the motions. Sunday evening, my phone rang and Trevor said he was bringing them back. They walked in looking tired but okay. Solomon ran to hug me, talking about the park Dad took them to. Jimena said the apartment was small but nice. Brandon pulled me aside and said it was fine, but Dad seemed sad all the time. The place was really small with one bedroom and a pull-out couch. Dad slept on the couch and gave them the bedroom. He'd tried to make it fun, but you could tell he was struggling. I hugged my son and told him I was glad he was home. My coworker Maria cornered me at lunch 2 weeks later saying I needed to get back out there. She had a friend, a nice guy named Noah, who was divorced with no kids. He was stable and funny, and she thought we'd get along. I said I wasn't ready, but she insisted. Just coffee, nothing serious. I agreed mostly to get her to stop asking. Noah met me at a coffee shop on Saturday afternoon while the kids were with Trevor. He was nice enough, average height with glasses and a friendly smile. We talked about our jobs and our divorces. He asked about my kids, and I spent the next 40 minutes talking about Brandon's grades and Jimena's art class and Solomon's soccer games. Noah listened politely, but I could tell he was losing interest. I couldn't help it. My kids were my whole life right now. When he asked about my hobbies, I realized I didn't have any. Everything I did revolved around the children. Noah paid for coffee and we said goodbye in the parking lot. He said it was nice meeting me but didn't ask for a second date. I drove home knowing I'd blown it but also not really caring. I wasn't ready to date. Wasn't ready to think about myself as anything other than a mother trying to keep her family stable. Maybe someday, but not now. Not when everything still felt so raw and complicated. Brandon came out of his therapy session with Isabella looking lighter somehow. We drove home and he told me he'd been talking about his anger toward Trevor. Isabella helped him understand that being mad at Dad was okay, but it didn't mean he had to stop loving him. That people could make terrible choices and still be worth caring about. Brandon said he understood Dad made bad choices, but he was still his father. That didn't erase everything good from before. I pulled into our driveway and turned to look at my son. Told him it was completely okay to love his dad while also being disappointed in his actions. That both feelings could exist at the same time. Brandon nodded and said Isabella told him the same thing. He was trying to forgive Dad, but it was hard. I hugged him and said forgiveness took time, that he didn't have to rush it or force it. His feelings were valid, whatever they were. Brandon went inside to do homework, and I sat in the car thinking about my own feelings toward Trevor. I wasn't sure I'd ever forgive him completely, but I could accept what happened and move forward. That seemed like enough for now. Thanksgiving was coming, and I had to figure out custody schedules for the first time. Trevor called asking if he could have the kids for Christmas morning. I said no immediately. That tradition was mine, and I wasn't ready to give it up. He argued that he deserved time with them on the actual holiday. I countered that he'd destroyed our family and lost the right to make demands about Christmas. We went back and forth for 20 minutes before Veronica stepped in with a compromise. Trevor could have the kids Christmas Eve overnight. They'd wake up at his apartment, open presents there, then come home to me by noon for Christmas dinner. I hated it, but agreed. The kids needed both parents in their lives, even if it meant sharing holidays. I called Trevor back with the plan, and he accepted. His voice was quiet, defeated. He thanked me for being reasonable, even though I didn't feel reasonable. I felt angry and sad and cheated out of the Christmas morning I'd always imagined. But this was the new reality. Shared custody meant shared holidays. I'd have to get used to it. Christmas Eve arrived, and I watched my kids pack their overnight bags for Trevor's apartment. Brandon folded his clothes carefully. Jimena stuffed her favorite stuffed animals into her backpack, and Solomon kept asking if he could bring all his toys. I helped them gather everything they needed while trying to keep my emotions in check. This was the first major holiday we'd spend apart, and it hurt more than I expected. Trevor picked them up at 6, and I hugged each of them goodbye, telling them to have fun and that I'd see them tomorrow. The house felt empty after they left. I sat on the couch staring at the Christmas tree we'd decorated together, all their handmade ornaments hanging from the branches. My sister called to check on me, and I told her I was fine even though I wasn't. I went to bed early, not wanting to think about my kids waking up somewhere else on Christmas morning. They came home at noon the next day, talking excitedly about the presents their dad got them. Brandon got a new gaming system, Jimena got art supplies, and Solomon got a giant box of building blocks. They were happy, and that's what mattered. I made Christmas dinner, and we opened more presents around our tree. The day felt different, but not bad. Just different. We were figuring out how to make this work. Trevor called in February to tell me his bankruptcy was officially discharged. His wages weren't being taken anymore, and he could actually afford things again. He said he was looking for a better apartment with 2 bedrooms, so the kids could have their own space when they visited. I told him that sounded good and meant it. The kids needed a comfortable place at both homes. A few weeks later, he moved into a nicer place across town with actual bedrooms instead of just a pull-out couch. The kids came back from their first weekend there, excited to show me pictures of their room. They had bunk beds and their own closet and space for their stuff. Trevor seemed to be accepting his situation instead of fighting against it. He was still their father, and I wanted him to be a good one, even if our marriage was over. My boss called me into her office in March, and I assumed I'd done something wrong. Instead, she told me the company was promoting me to senior analyst with a significant salary increase. I'd been handling extra projects since the divorce, throwing myself into work to stay busy, and apparently it showed. The raise meant I could put more money into the kids' college funds and start an actual emergency savings account, instead of just hoping nothing broke. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The financial stress that had been weighing on me eased up. I could breathe a little easier knowing we were secure. That night, I took the kids out for ice cream to celebrate and didn't worry about the cost. The independence felt powerful. I was taking care of my family on my own, and it was working. Jimena came out of her therapy session with Isabella in April and seemed more relaxed than usual. On the drive home, she told me Isabella said she was doing really well adjusting to having two homes. She wasn't as sad anymore and felt okay about the new normal. Solomon had been telling Isabella he liked having two houses because it meant two sets of toys and two rooms to play in. He talked about Dad's house and Mom's house like they were just normal parts of his life. Brandon's teacher called to say his grades had improved and he seemed more focused in class. His anger had transformed into something else, a maturity that made him seem older than 12. All three of them were finding their way through this. I ran into Trevor at Brandon's school science fair in May. We stood awkwardly near the refreshment table before he started asking about the kids' progress. I told him about their therapy updates and Brandon's improved grades. He looked genuinely happy to hear it. Then he apologized again for everything, saying he was in therapy now working on himself. He wanted to understand why he'd made such terrible choices. I told him I appreciated that, and was glad he was being a good father, despite everything that happened. We talked for another 10 minutes about normal parent stuff like summer camps and school supply lists. It felt strange, but not bad. We could do this co-parenting thing without hating each other. Lila came over for dinner in June, and we sat on the back porch after the kids went to bed. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything. I could have made Trevor's life much harder, could have turned the kids against him, could have dragged everything out in court, but I chose to protect the kids and let them love their father. She said that took real strength. I told her I did it for Brandon, Jimena, and Solomon, not for Trevor. They needed both parents in their lives even if those parents weren't together anymore. Lila squeezed my hand and said I was a better person than she would have been. I didn't feel particularly noble. I just felt tired and ready to move forward. 6 months after the divorce was final, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I felt genuinely happy. The house was peaceful without the tension of Trevor's lies hanging over everything. My kids were laughing in the living room playing a board game. I had money in savings and a job I was good at. The panic and anger that had consumed me for months had faded into something manageable. I wasn't interested in dating yet, couldn't imagine letting someone new into our lives, but I was open to the possibility eventually. Maybe someday. For now, I was content with the life I'd built for myself and my children. Brandon mentioned in July that their dad had a girlfriend. The kids had met her a few times and said she was nice but not trying to be their mom. Her name was Sarah and she worked as a nurse. She knew about the affair and the divorce and accepted Trevor anyway. I felt relieved hearing that. Trevor had found someone appropriate who understood his situation. He wasn't repeating his pattern of lies and manipulation. The kids seemed comfortable with her, which was all that mattered. I didn't need to meet Sarah or be friends with her. I just needed to know she was treating my children well. I used money from my promotion to take the kids on vacation to the beach in August. We spent a week building sandcastles, collecting shells, and swimming in the ocean. Brandon taught Solomon how to body surf, and Jimena found a perfect sand dollar she wanted to keep forever. We ate ice cream for dinner one night and stayed up late watching movies. On the last evening, Brandon and I walked along the shore while the younger two played in the sand. He told me this was the happiest he'd seen me in forever. I realized he was right. I was happy. Actually happy. Not just pretending for their sake. Isabella called in September to discuss the kids' progress. They were adjusting well to their family structure and didn't need weekly therapy anymore. She recommended monthly check-ins just to make sure everyone stayed on track. The kids had done the work and come through it okay. I scheduled my own therapy appointment for later that week because I wanted to keep processing everything. The sessions helped me plan for the future instead of dwelling on the past. And I was building a new life and I needed support to do it right. I called the bank in October to ask about refinancing options. The house needed some repairs and I'd taken out a small mortgage to cover the work. My credit was solid and the interest rates had dropped since I'd originally borrowed the money. The loan officer scheduled an appointment with an appraiser to evaluate the property's current value. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with his clipboard and measuring tape, walking through each room and taking notes. He examined the kitchen renovations, the updated bathrooms, and the new roof I'd installed last spring. When he finished his assessment, he told me the house had increased in value by almost 30% since my grandmother had left it to me. The neighborhood had become more desirable, and properties like mine were selling quickly. I sat at the kitchen table after he left, thinking about my grandmother and how she'd worked her entire life to buy this house. She'd paid it off years before she died and made sure it went directly to me, not to my parents who might have sold it. She'd given me security I didn't even understand until Trevor tried to take it away. The refinancing went through within 3 weeks, and my monthly payment dropped by $200. That money went straight into the kids' college fund. Trevor sent me a text in November asking if we could switch to a shared calendar app for coordinating the kids' schedules. He'd missed a soccer game because I'd told him about it through email, and he claimed he hadn't seen the message. I downloaded the app and started entering all the kids' activities, medical appointments, and school events. He did the same with his visitation schedule and any plans he made with them. We kept our messages focused entirely on logistics. No personal comments, no discussions about our failed marriage, just information about Brandon, Jimena, and Solomon. It worked surprisingly well. I could see when he planned to pick them up, what activities he'd scheduled during his weekends, and any changes to his availability. He could see the same from my end. We weren't friends, and we'd never be friends, but we'd figured out how to cooperate for the sake of our children. The anger I'd felt for so long had faded into something manageable. I didn't hate him anymore. I just felt nothing when I thought about him, which seemed like progress. The following October marked a year since the divorce was finalized. My sister suggested I host a dinner party to celebrate moving forward with my life. I invited Lila, Remy, Maddox, and a few close friends who'd supported me through everything. I spent the afternoon cooking and setting the table, feeling genuinely excited about having people in my house for something happy. The kids helped me arrange flowers and put out the good dishes. Everyone arrived around 6, bringing wine and desserts and filling the house with conversation and laughter. My father stood up halfway through dinner and raised his glass. He talked about resilience and new beginnings, about how proud he was of the way I'd protected my children and rebuilt our lives. He said I'd shown incredible strength, and he knew my grandmother would be proud. I looked around the table at my kids, my sister, my brother, my parents, and the friends who'd stayed by my side. I had everything I truly needed right there in that room. The life I'd built wasn't the one I'd planned, but it was good, and it was mine, and nobody could take it away from me. I tucked Solomon into bed one night in late October after reading him his favorite story. He looked up at me with his serious 6-year-old expression and told me he was happy even though things were different now. He said he loved both his parents and liked having 2 homes where people wanted him. He got to have 2 Christmases and 2 birthdays, and Dad's apartment had a pool. I kissed his forehead and smoothed his hair back, feeling my chest tighten with emotion. We'd all survived this crisis and come out stronger on the other side. My kids were okay. They were more than okay. They were thriving despite everything that had happened. I turned off his light and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him settle into sleep. Then I went downstairs to my own life, my own home, my own future that belonged entirely to me.